Hey there everyone, Benchy here from Benchy and Gaming. Today we're going to be taking a look at this, which is the Core 2 Duo E7500, which had its initial release back in January 2009 at a price of $133 US, which, adjusting for inflation, is around $159 US today, or around £124 or €143. The 7000 series of Core 2 Duos was originally intended to replace the E4000 series of Core 2 Duos, and they used the Wolfdale 3M architecture, which is the exact same as the Wolfdale full fat architecture that the E8000 series of Core 2 Duos used, just with 3MB of the 6MB of L2 cache disabled. Now, one of the things that's particularly impressive about the 7000 series, at least this specific chip anyway, is just how overclockable it is, which I'll hopefully go into in a bit later on in the video. Oh God, Horace. Jesus Christ, Horace, what the hell, man? Oh. Horace, the hell have you done? Look, Horace, I realise your owner's been putting you through a lot of stress lately, but that does not give you the right to take out your frustrations and insecurities out on innocent people. You can't just go around doing that. Something his owner could do with taking a note of. Oh, God. Roll the intro. As I mentioned before, Horace attacked me. The E7500 launched at $133 US, but I actually picked this up for free, courtesy of Patreon supporter Tasfi Dodge, who I'll link to down in the description below. However, you can actually buy it pretty cheaply on eBay here in the UK at only £1.69 and for only $2.56 on ebay.com over in America, although that'll still actually come from the UK. That aside, the price you can buy it for is a bargain for something which could potentially breathe some much needed life into an ageing Socket 775 system. God, I hope Horace doesn't attack me again. That really hurt. But anyway, specs, Specs, that's what I was going to talk about. Packing 228 million transistors, built on the 45nm fabrication process, E7500 ran at 2.93 GHz, with a front-side bus speed of 266 MHz, or 1066 MHz effective. It carried support for DDR, DDR2 and DDR3 memory. It had 64 KB of L1 cache per core, and the aforementioned 3MB of L2 cache, which was shared between both cores. So to see what kind of performance it will offer today, I'm going to be running it through the usual suite of benchmarks and games. But first, here's a rundown of the system I'm using the E7500 in, which some of you will no doubt be familiar with by now. It features a Gigabyte GA-EP45-DS3L motherboard, 8GB of DDR2 RAM running at 800MHz, using timings of CL55515, a MSI GTX 1080 Armor OC Edition graphics card, Windows 7 Ultimate 64-bit, and the Phanteks TC14PE cooler. I'm also running the games and OS from mechanical hard drives, so let's get on with the tests. Horace, I can see you behind me. I'm doing a voiceover. Bugger off. Kicking off the benchmarks for today is Cinebench R20, a benchmark useful for testing your processor's multi-core performance. To get a score representative of what the E7500 is reliably capable of, I'm running the test 3 times and averaging out the scores afterwards. The E7500 at its standard speed of 2.93 GHz managed 3 runs of 347, 346 and 345 points respectively, which gives an average score of 346 points. You can compare that to some of the inbuilt scores on the left. That aside, what about an overclock? I mean, I did mention great overclockability, and totally didn't write and record this before I recorded the intro or anything like that. Totally didn't do that. With a voltage of between 1.376 to 1.392 volts, the E7500 managed a whopping 4.1 GHz, with the RAM now at 933 MHz. I'll put the settings I used for this down in the description below. With that huge an increase in clocks came a huge increase in score, with the 3 tests now scoring 482, 484 and 484 points respectively, giving an average score of 483.33 points, a 39.69% increase over what it managed at stock clocks. Next up is the physics portion of 3DMark's Firestrike benchmark, which is a pretty quick benchmark to run, and also quite popular amongst other reviewers as well. I'll be doing the same as I did with Cinebench and running the test 3 times so I can get an average score, as with benchmarks like these, the score often varies and could potentially give an unrealistic representation of what a component is capable of doing repeatedly. In its 3 runs, the 7500 was able to score 2,477, 2,482 and 2,487 points respectively, giving out an average score of 2,482 points. With the huge 4.1 GHz overclock though, came another huge increase in score, with runs of 3,492, 3,533 and 3,504 points respectively, which gives us an average score of 3,509.67 points, or in other words, an increase in average score of 41.4%. First up, let's kick off with a personal favourite of mine, Warframe, a game I've recently gotten back into. I'm running this at 1080p using the lowest possible settings, with ATEX anisotropic filtering and trilinear filtering enabled. Both tests actually ran reasonably well, as you can see from the benchmark figures. I did initially run around the Landercraft a bit to gauge performance there, and both did show a brief moment of stutter. However, these were so small that they won't affect gameplay whatsoever. Stock clocks did have an issue with some noticeable stuttering at the start of the test, but ran pretty well throughout the rest of it. The overclock, on the other hand, also ran really well throughout. However, you will notice some stuttering in the most intense scenes, although overall the FPS won't really drop below the high 50s, the stock clocks managing to drop no lower than around 44 FPS. Neither had any issues with input lag or locking, nor did they show any issues with the fire rate of weapons slowing down, which is something I found to be quite common in underpowered processors in Warframe. Stock clocks managed average 1% and 0.1% low frame rates of 55, 34 and 28 FPS respectively, with spikes in its frame times throughout, which could reach up to around 40 milliseconds, and one of 100 milliseconds as well. The overclock though improved the average massively to 70 FPS, however the 1% and 0.1% lows didn't show as much of a boost, with 41 and 34 FPS respectively. It had some spikes in its frame times throughout, reaching up to around 40 milliseconds, with some more of around 75 to 120 milliseconds, and a couple more reaching around 220 milliseconds. Next up, we're jumping into CSGO, which, despite being 7 years old, is currently, at the time of writing at least, second in Steam's list of most played games by current player count. I'm also running this at 1080p using the lowest settings possible, with 16x anisotropic filtering. I had tried running with higher settings, but reduced them to as low as they could go, in an attempt to minimise the stuttering that higher settings saw. I'm also running the test in a hard difficulty competitive bot match on the Mirage map. I am looking to move to a different map for testing, as I've been using Mirage for quite a while, so feel free to suggest maps for me to use below. That aside, both tests offered playable enough experiences. Stock clocks did have issues with noticeable stuttering in close combat, and it was fairly noticeable when turning the camera as well. But the issues weren't major enough to have made it unplayable. And despite a pretty decent improvement in performance, the overclock still had some issues in combat, with brief lockups and stuttering, although it wasn't to the extent that combat was affected by it. It also never had issues with stuttering when turning the camera like stock clocks did. Stuttering aside though, both tests saw FPS figures well over 60 at times, with stock clocks managing to get into the low 80s to low 90s, and the overclock pushing this even further with figures into the high 110s. These were the highest figures I saw in a particular location on the map, so it isn't representative of the rest of the map. Stock clocks managed 58, 33 and 23 FPS for its average 1% and 0.1% low frame rates respectively, and had several spikes in its frame times throughout the test of around 45 to 60 milliseconds, and several more hitting around 150 to 180 milliseconds. The overclock improved the benchmark figures massively, with an average of 77 FPS, and 1% and 0.1% lows of 46 and 36 FPS respectively. There were multiple spikes in frame times throughout the test, hitting around 100 to 200 milliseconds. Now it's on to GTA 5, which I'm running at 1080p on the lowest possible settings, with 16x anisotropic filtering. I was probably expecting far too much from the E7500, as I was a bit disappointed that with the overclock the game still didn't perform that well. Overall, I'd say that the game was in fact playable in both tests, at least to me anyway. But both tests had some fairly noticeable issues, namely the stuttering you're no doubt noticing throughout the city. Speaking of which, I noticed that the stuttering actually seemed to lessen during daytime within the game, which is most likely to do with the shadows. Stock clocks did manage to get into the low 30s throughout the city, but could drop as low as 21, and like I said, there was a very noticeable amount of stuttering throughout the city at the start of the test. The overclock still had issues with this as well, but could get into the low 50s FPS wise, showing that decent FPS doesn't necessarily equate to decent performance. Further out of the city, performance noticeably improved, but it was by no means perfect, as throughout the test, stock clocks had a few issues with minor input locking, and possibly a very small amount of input lag too, which the overclock had no issues with at all. The stuttering was also still noticeable at points throughout the game, with the desert area of the map being particularly problematic at times for the overclock, which as you'll see from the 0.1% low figures, actually had more severe stutter at times. I'm assuming this could be caused by the overclock being potentially unstable, leading to some inconsistent performance. Stock clocks had some moments here where there was noticeable micro stuttering, but it tended to run relatively smoothly out here. The average 1% and 0.1% lows for stock were 28, 14 and 10 FPS respectively. It had very inconsistent frame times, represented by the stuttering you saw, with spikes of up to around 100 to 150 milliseconds, a couple reaching 200 milliseconds, and one of 400 milliseconds. The overclock managed 37, 19 and only 5 FPS for its average 1% and 0.1% lows respectively. It had several spikes in frame times reaching up to around 80 milliseconds, several more reaching around 220 milliseconds, and somewhere around 220 to 280 milliseconds mark. And to close out the test for today, it's Rise of the Tomb Raider. It's not the most recent game in the rebooted Tomb Raider series, but out of the games in the test today, it's the one most likely to produce the worst results. I went into this test knowing full well the performance was going to be poor, even with an overclock, but I thought it'd be quite interesting to see how a 10-year-old processor copes with a reasonable new game, given that the PC version launched only 3 years ago. I'm also running the game at 1080p with the lowest possible settings and 16x anisotropic filtering. As expected, performance at the start of the test was really poor, with very obvious stuttering at stock, although admittedly not as bad as I thought it would have been. The overclock managed to reduce the stuttering massively, but it was still apparent on a couple of occasions. The improvement couldn't save the overclock though, as both tests still had very noticeable issues with stuttering throughout the entire test. Both also had issues with the game's scripted sequences, in which they would take a bit more time to start. A fairly insignificant amount of time, mind you, but it was noticeable nonetheless. Surprisingly, the overclock ran relatively smoothly in the Soviet installation and had no issues with object rendering or texture popping at all, unlike stock clocks, which had noticeable issues with stuttering, although admittedly it doesn't seem that bad until you see it side by side with the overclock. It had major issues with texture popping and objects not rendering at all, like at the Wolf Den where the interior took literally minutes to even appear, and objects like doors that you would normally have to pull down using an arrow weren't there, meaning you could just walk straight through. Performance was even worse for stock in the copper mill, with the overclock struggling with the stuttering here as well, although nowhere near as bad as stock had it. Stock clocks managed average 1% and 0.1% lows of 37, 13 and 9 FPS respectively. It had spikes in frame times throughout the test, hitting up to around 120 milliseconds, a couple more hitting 560 milliseconds, and one of 2.26 seconds. The overclock, other than an improved average of 42 FPS, was pretty much identical in performance, with a 1% low of 13, the same as stock, and a slightly worse 0.1% low of 8 FPS. There were also a lot of frame time spikes throughout the test, reaching around 120 to 140 milliseconds, somewhere around 220 to 300 milliseconds, and two of 980 milliseconds and 1.2 seconds respectively. So yeah, the tests are done. Please don't do that again, Horace. But yeah, now that the tests are done, the 7500 is actually a hell of a lot more capable today than initially was expecting it to be. I mean, as you saw with games like Rise of the Tomb Raider, it's obviously not going to be anywhere near good enough for the most recent games, or sort of just in games that are more intense, like that one is. But oh god. But even that surpassed my expectations wildly. I went into it expecting it to be horrible, but with the overclock, some parts that are typically a lot harder to run, like the Soviet installation, actually performed a hell of a lot better than I thought it would. Then we've got games like CSGO, which was a bit disappointed with, because despite how good the performance was with the overclock, it did still have the odd stutter now and again, and it didn't perform, or it just didn't perform as well as I thought it would. But yeah, something like Warframe, for example, the 7500 would be perfect for, because when I'd initially started up the test for that, for this video, I was actually mid-mission on my own personal playthrough of it. So I played through a mission of my own story on it, and it was great, no problems at all. But yeah, God, I can't think straight because I'm just so terrified Horace is going to attack me again. Before we finish up today, I'd like to give a special shout out to Patreon supporter TazFeDodge for helping to make all of this possible. You'll find him at TazFeDodge on Twitter, and on YouTube with the same name too. If you enjoyed this video, please consider leaving a comment and a like, and subscribing to my channel if you'd like to see more content like this, and maybe even sharing the video with people you think may enjoy it. And although there's no obligation to do so, you can support me in creating these videos from my Patreon at patreon.com/benchygaming, or through Ko-fi at ko-fi.com/benchygaming. And if you do decide to become a patron, you'll also gain early access to all of my videos for as long as you remain a patron. So thanks for watching my video. It means a lot that you would take the time to watch my content. Hopefully I'll see you in the next one. And hopefully Horace won't attack me.